thing that the thing that interests me when I was reading the book, and we touched on it briefly just now, was that transatlantic slavery, the system that was in place. I mean, I knew of it slightly, but I didn't know the extent of the damage or the effect that it had in growing the industrial revolution or the sort of the capitalist system across the whole world, really, but in Europe in particular. It'd be good to just describe that, the impact that had, and the defining role that played in not only the effect of the minorities, the black and brown, but also in the growth of Western empires.
Yeah, so the Atlantic system is absolutely essential, right? So when Columbus goes to the Americas, finds first it's gold. So the first thing which enslaved is gold, largely in Brazil. It's Portugal and Spain who are kind of dominant. This is important because this is actually, again, when we think about gold, and gold's so important now. There's a very clear link there, right? And that gold is important because that starts to bring some wealth. And interestingly, it's actually gold and silver. The first demand for that is actually China. It's actually the East. So we're already starting to see it as a kind of global system. And that's important, but it's also limited. So there's like Spain and Portugal start off predominant, but because it's gold, it stagnates. What really unleashes the West is when it starts to be commodities which are necessary for production, right? So gold and silver are kind of like precious jewels. They're nice to have, but they're not productive. And it really is when you start to do sugar, where you can commodity, things like tobacco and cotton. I mean, cotton is probably the big one, where it really changes everything. And when you start, and these are all produced through slave labor, which is 300 years of free labor. Like you've just literally extracted millions, tens of millions of people. The estimate is at least 12 million people were stolen from the African continent, and that's the low end of the estimate. It's estimated that probably only accounts for about a third of the people who were actually taken. About 40% of people died resisting on the continent, and about up to 50% on the ships. So you're talking about that 12 million times that by at least 3. So the minimum estimate is 36-40 million, and there's much higher estimates. You're talking about potentially 100 million people taken from the African continent.
Yeah, and you said in the book that even up to 24 million died during that period.
I mean, yeah, it's a huge, and you can imagine, like, so what that does is, one, that they are then used as commodities, and this is the difference between the Arab slave trade. So the Arab slave trade actually lasts longer and it slaves more people, but the Arab slave trade is very different in the sense that it's mostly for it's mostly rich people who have taken servants, right? They don't earn money, they're not productive. Right?
That's the Arab way to do it. It's just to show people. They don't care about making money. They just want to show to their friends that they've got more women.
Exactly. It was largely like that, right? There's stories. I think I recount a story in the book where the slave traders get really rich, right? But they got nowhere to spend the money. They got all this money, but they got nothing to do with it. That's not the European system. The European system was very different. Africans are turned into commodities who produced untold wealth through things like sugar, cotton, etc. And it's that wealth which is absolutely essential in leading to industrialization. So the first thing, I'm from Birmingham, we love James Watt over here, but James Watt loved the slave trade because the first thing that they used James Watt steam engine for was sugar plantations. I mean, sugar is the first thing which goes through that process, and then cotton. Obviously, cotton is so important to British industrial development. It's all slave produced, and what that does is it creates this massive amount of wealth, which then allows the West to take over. Remember, before Europe was not advanced, it was behind. And it really is the Atlantic system which gives the wealth, the power to kind of conquer the world. And then if you think about the impact that has on somewhere like Africa, so when Europe goes to Africa, again, something I really want to push on here is that Africa was not some backwards, naked savages in the jungle nonsense that we kind of see. That wasn't the case. Africa was, again, advanced, and Europe couldn't conquer Africa. But the point where Europe goes there, they cannot conquer Africa. But by drawing out all these people through slavery, it devastates the African continent. I mean, imagine 36 million people, working age, taken away. Just that in itself. Then the whole political economy changes because people want to defend themselves from slavery. Slavery becomes a major thing. It just totally destroys Africa. And then that actually allows Europeans to then come in and conquer the continent. And then you have colonialism. But colonialism in Africa is less than 100 years in most places, direct colonialism. Because it takes slavery really weakening the continent for that to happen. So it's slavery is such. Yeah, and I was speaking to, who was I talking to the other day? Melanie Phillips, who's awful, terrible right-wing journalist who just putting forward this myth that the slave trade wasn't that big of the part of the economy, just a tiny bit of the economy. It's the whole economy, because without slavery, you don't have anything else. Industrialization just isn't possible. And the wealth isn't possible.
Does she mean now, or does she mean in the past?
No, in the past. In the past, there is actually, I'm having a debate in March with a British historian who argues that, you know, if you add up the slave voyages, the slave ship voyages, and say, oh well, you know, they didn't make that much money, it's just a stupid way to look at it. Because unlike in the Arab trade, where the money was in the trade itself, where, you know, traders made lots and lots of money. The money here was not in the trade. There was money in the trade; it was profitable. Don't get me wrong, but the real money was in the plantations. It was in the system. It was in the commodities that was produced. It then goes into factories, etc., etc. That's where the money is. So you can isolate out, well, how much money do you make from slave voyages? That's irrelevant. The impact on the impact on the wider economy, none of which can happen without your commodities like sugar, cotton, etc. etc.
Yeah, I mean, you gave the example in the book about the idea about the actual cost of the slave wasn't the actual goal, because there was a story you gave where they were on a ship and then they were running out of water, and then they couldn't give enough water to everyone, including the slaves. So I think they threw like 150 overboard or something.
Yeah,
so they didn't particularly care too much about the actual individuals. It's more what was the efficiency of it. And it sounds horrible when you think about it, because you're talking about real people. It's very easy to just, like, in the debate that you're going to have, it's very easy to just say, oh, there were slaves and then they had this and this. And I feel like when I was reading it, I felt it's very easy to get into sort of a checks and balances between what the value was, and like, no, these were actually people.
Yeah, but they weren't treated, but they were 100% commodities. And actually, the Zong tells you then it's not just about even the direct commodity production, but things like insurance. Like the reason the reason that case came to the court wasn't because of did we murder 100 people. It was, can I claim on my insurance? We're literally an insurance case. Like, just imagine that. Like somebody kills 150 people and it's an insurance case. And insurance was absolutely, so it's companies like Lloyd's of London, for example, started off insuring slave ships. That's what they did. And now Lloyd's of London is Britain's biggest company. That's not a coincidence, right? That seems like it's probably not a coincidence. So yeah, that's how embedded it is today, I think.
The thing that I was interested in getting your take on when I was reading all of this is you were discussing the idea of reparations, or what reparations might look like. What does that look like in your view? Because I can't see how that system would work. How would you go about tallying that and equating a value towards that? Or do you think it's just the value is so astronomical, it would just, like you said in the book, it would just bring the whole system down?
Yeah, I mean, there are a number of credible reparations movements. So CARICOM, Caribbean Community, want reparations at the minute. African countries had the Organization African Unity wanted reparations. There's a group every year marches in Britain, Stop the Mangamizi. There's lots of arguments for reparations. So I don't want to pour scorn totally on them, because I don't want to do that. But if I'm honest, if you actually look at what reparations for me is, it tells you need revolution. Because actually, to add up the money, it is too much. Like, there's no possible way that how could you account for all of that in all the industries and all the figure. So the best example of that would be when the British government paid slave owners reparations, which they did. We call it compensation, but this is called it reparations, to abolish the system in 1834. It was 40% of the government's income at the time, 5% of GDP. That was just to compensate them for their losses. How much would that have been if you were going to pay the enslaved what they were due? And then for centuries. And it was so large that they only paid they took a loan from the Bank of England. They only paid back in 2015. I mean, that's just one example. So multiply that by 20, and what you got? The figure in the States is, they reckon it's between 4 trillion and 15 trillion. In the Caribbean was something similar to that. When you add it up, it's an astronomical figure, and I don't think it can be repaid. And then the second part of why the problem is, remember, this isn't past, so the world still depends on the exploitation of Africa, Caribbean, other parts of the world, and also it's not just slavery. India, we kind of had to pay India back. The reparations has to be broader, right?
Thank you for watching this video. To listen to the full podcast, click the link in the description below.